The doors of the Metropolitan Tabernacle open at 5, though the service will not begin until 7, and still there is a crowd on the pavement at Elephant and Castle before the gas lamps have properly caught the dusk. A costermonger who has washed the fish smell from his hands as best he could. 2 clerks from a counting house on Cheapside, still in their collars. A widow from Camberwell who has not missed a Thursday evening in 6 years. They come on foot, by omnibus, by the new underground railway that rattles them up from the city, and by the time the doors swing wide, there is already a queue 3 deep around the corner into Newington Butts. By 6:30 every pew on the ground floor is taken. By 10 to 7 the first gallery is full, then the second, then the topmost gallery under the very roof, where latecomers crane over the rail to see a building that seats 6,000, and this evening, as most evenings, will hold every one of them, and turn away hundreds more. There is no organ. There will be no choir in the robed, processional sense that a visitor from a cathedral town might expect. A precentor stands, pitches a note, and 6,000 voices, dockhands and dressmakers, magistrates and matchgirls, rise together into Isaac Watts without a single instrument beneath them. The sound does not need one. It fills the hall the way water fills a basin, from every side at once, and for a moment before the sermon even begins, a stranger might wonder if he has come not to a church at all, but to the one place in London where ordinary people still sing like they mean it. Then the man they have come to hear climbs the pulpit stairs. He is not tall. He will not, this evening or any evening, wear a black gown or a hood or a stole. He stands in a plain dark suit, as any nonconformist minister of his convictions would, because the pulpit belongs to the word and not to vestments. He carries no sheaf of manuscript. There is a single card in his hand, a page of notes scratched out that afternoon, headings and scripture references, and perhaps 3 or 4 turns of phrase he does not want to lose, nothing more. He has never in his life read a sermon to a congregation, and he never will. What is coming is not memorized, and it is not improvised in the loose sense either. It has been prayed over since Saturday, turned and returned in his mind on his walks, tested against the text in Greek and Hebrew, and now it is ready to be spoken the way a man speaks to a friend across a table, except that this table seats 6,000, and there is no table at all, only air. He opens in prayer, and the hall goes so quiet that a visitor could hear the gas jets hiss. Then he begins to preach, and something happens that no one in that room, however many times they have sat under it, ever quite gets used to. He does not shout. He has trained his voice too well for that, trained it across years of open-air preaching to farm labourers in Cambridgeshire fields and to crowds in London parks, before ever a building like this existed to hold him, trained it the way a singer trains an instrument, learning to drop his register low and let a word travel on its own weight rather than force. And so a man in the back row of the highest gallery, 70 yards from the pulpit rail, with no microphone, no amplification of any kind but the shape of the hall itself and the shape of one Essex-born throat, hears every syllable as clearly as the woman sitting directly beneath the sounding board. Visitors write home about it as though they had witnessed a small miracle of engineering. It is not engineering, it is a gift, disciplined by thousands of hours nobody saw, and this evening, as on every evening he preaches, it does exactly what it was built to do. It makes 6,000 strangers feel that he is speaking only to them. The text tonight, as on most nights, is not chosen for effect. It might be 4 verses from Isaiah, or a single clause out of Paul's letter to the Romans, or some obscure line from an Old Testament narrative that a lesser preacher would pass over as background scenery. He will spend the first minutes simply opening it, what the words meant to the people who first heard them, what the Hebrew or the Greek will and will not bear, sometimes a joke at his own expense, or at the expense of some pretension he cannot abide, and the hall laughs out loud. In a building full of people who have come to hear about sin and grace and the blood of Christ, because he does not believe holiness requires a face like a tombstone. Then, without any seam the listener can quite locate, the joke is gone and the text is turning toward the cross, and by the time he reaches the center of the sermon, the laughter of 10 minutes before feels like it happened in another country. He is a Calvinist, and he does not apologize for it, tonight or any night. The doctrines of grace are not to this man a fence to keep sinners out or a puzzle for seminary common rooms. Election, atonement, the sovereign mercy of God reaching down to raise up men and women who could not and would not save themselves. This is not doctrine held at arm's length. It is the marrow of what he is saying, the reason the sermon has any right to exist at all, Because if grace were not utterly free and utterly the Lord's own work, there would be no good news worth walking to Elephant and Castle on a wet Thursday to hear. He preaches election as a comfort, not a chill. He preaches the cross as though he had stood at the foot of it that afternoon. And then, near the end, his voice changes again, not louder, but nearer, as though the walls of the tabernacle have drawn in around every single hearer at once, and he speaks directly to whoever in that vast room has not yet come to Christ. He does not manage this with theatrics. There is no organ swelling underneath him, no walk to the front, no card to fill in. He simply turns, in plain and burning English, to the sinner, wherever the sinner is sitting, in the front pew or in the very last row under the roof, and tells him that Christ is willing, that the door is not shut, that tonight, this hour, before the gas lamps are put out, is not too soon, and may be later than the sinner thinks. Men who are brought to that gallery on a dare to see the famous young preacher everyone in London was talking about, will later date the whole of their lives from that turn in his voice. Some of them are sitting in this room right now, converted on some other ordinary Thursday, come back because they cannot stay away. He closes in prayer as quietly as he began. There is no soloist, no closing hymn built for sentiment. The final hymn is sung the way the first one was, 6,000 voices and no organ, and then the benediction falls over the hall like something physically laid on it, and for a moment nobody moves. Off to one side, near the front, a man has been writing the entire time. His hand has not stopped moving since the opening prayer. He is a shorthand reporter, and by tomorrow morning his notes will be transcribed, and by Wednesday the whole sermon, every joke, every turn toward the cross, every direct word to the sinner in the gallery, will be set in type and printed as a single sermon pamphlet, sold for a penny on stalls from Cornwall to Aberdeen, mailed to soldiers in India and settlers in the Australian bush, and lonely farmers on the American prairie who have never once seen this man's face and never will, but who wait for his sermon every week the way another household waits for a letter. By the time this particular Thursday evening has cooled into memory, the words spoken in this room to 6,000 people will already be traveling towards 600,000 more, and by the time this man is in his grave, they will have reached further than that, further, in fact, than any living voice of his century, further than he himself will ever fully know. It would be easy, watching this from the topmost gallery, to think the whole of it comes effortlessly to him. The joke, the turn, the tenderness, the thunder, the voice that fills a hall built for 6,000 without a single mechanical aid. It does not come effortlessly, it never has. Downstairs, after the crowd has filed out past midnight into a London that is only now remembering it as weather and cabs and Thursday night ordinariness again, the man who filled that room will sit for a while in a small vestry, and the strength that carried to the back gallery an hour before will have gone out of him almost entirely. He suffers, and has suffered for years, from a gout that some nights makes the walk up those pulpit stairs an act of open defiance against his own body. He will preach again on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, and lecture to his students on Friday, and visit the sick, and answer a stack of letters that would exhaust 3 secretaries, and edit the magazine that carries his name across the world, and none of it costs him nothing. The voice that seems, from the gallery, like the easiest thing in the world is in fact the most expensive thing he owns, and he has been spending it, without much thought for the balance, since before most of the young clerks in tonight's congregation were born. He is not called the Prince of Preachers because he crowned himself. It is a title London pressed on him, not this congregation only, but a whole generation of believers across denominations who came, or sent for the printed word, or simply heard the name spoken in the same breath as Whitefield and Wesley and did not think it strange. He would be the first to wave the title off, the first to say the credit belongs entirely to the one whose gospel he was given to carry, and he would mean it, not as false modesty but as plain fact as he understood it. Still, the name has stuck, because nothing else quite covers what happens in that hall on an ordinary Thursday night. There is no other minister in England, and very likely none anywhere in the English-speaking world just now, who can fill a room of 6,000 people without amplification and hold every one of them still, and do it not once as a novelty, but week after week, year after year, for decades, until the doing of it stops being remarkable to anyone but the visitors who have never seen it before. But the man standing in that vestry with his foot propped and his collar loosened was not born to this. Nobody arrives in a pulpit like the Tabernacles by accident of birth or smoothness of path. He was not raised in London, was not trained at Oxford or Cambridge. did not come up through the customary channels that produced the fashionable preachers of his day. He came, in fact, from about as far from Elephant and Castle as the England of his century could arrange, from a low, wet stretch of Essex farmland, where the loudest sound most evenings was the wind moving through elm trees, and where a boy without a single obvious advantage was, by every account anyone could have given at the time, no likelier to fill 6,000 seats a night than to fly. Something happened to that boy, in a house full of old books and a grandfather's long memory, long before there was any tabernacle to fill. To understand the man in the vestry, with his foot propped on a stool, worn out from carrying a gospel to 6,000 people who had come running to hear it, the story has to go back past the fame, past the magazines sold on every corner, past the sermons crossing oceans in the hold of a ship, back to a lane in Essex, and a boy, and a room full of Puritan divinity, gathering dust until the day someone finally opened it. The house at Stambourne stood behind a yew tree older than the parish records, and inside it, in a room he was small enough to get lost in, a boy sat on the floor of his grandfather's study, surrounded by books that smelled of leather and tallow smoke. He would remember that room for the rest of his life, not as a boy remembers a place he visited, but as a man remembers the room where he first learned to breathe. His grandfather, James Spurgeon, had been the independent minister at Stambourne for decades by the time Charles arrived there as a toddler of 18 months, sent from his parents' home in Colchester to live under the old man's roof for reasons of family circumstance that mattered far less, in the end, than what that roof turned out to contain. What it contained was a library any Puritan divine would have recognized as his own. Manton was there, and Brooks, and Sibbs, and Charnock, volumes with broken spines and browned pages, the working tools of 2 centuries of gospel ministry stacked on shelves a small child could reach if he stood on a chair. Chief among them, worn soft from handling, was John Fox's Book of Martyrs, its woodcuts of flame and faith spread across pages the boy pored over before he was old enough to read every word beneath them. He took to colouring those woodcuts by hand, dabbing pigment onto the fires that consumed Ridley and Latimer, absorbed in the work the way only a child can be absorbed, not yet understanding that he was tracing, with his own small fingers, the shape of a faith that cost something. He did not know yet what the martyrs had died believing. He knew only that the pictures held him, and that his grandfather's shelves were full of men who had thought hard and suffered long over questions Charles Haddon Spurgeon would spend his own life answering from a pulpit. His grandfather preached the doctrines of grace without apology, in the plain, unhurried cadence of a man who had said the same true things every Sunday for 40 years and expected to go on saying them. And it was in that manse, under that preaching, that the boy first encountered something else, not yet a memory of his own conversion, but a memory of being noticed. Richard Knill, a missionary of some renown, came to stay at Stambourne when Charles was a small boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, and took an interest in the minister's grandson that the family never forgot. Knill walked with the boy in the garden, prayed with him beneath a mulberry tree, and told those gathered, the family, whoever was near, that this child would one day preach the gospel to multitudes, would preach in Rowland Hill's old chapel in London, and would see souls saved in numbers none of them could yet imagine. He gave the boy a shilling to buy a copy of Watts's Divine and Moral Songs, on the condition that whenever Charles used it, he would sing the hymn God Moves in a Mysterious Way. It was the kind of promise a grown man makes to a child half in earnest and half in play, and the kind of promise the child, for all his life afterward, took entirely seriously. Years later, on the very platform of Rowland Hill's Surrey Chapel, Spurgeon told that story from memory, still moved by it, still certain that God had marked him out even then, before he had the faintest notion of his own need, because the need was coming, it was not long in coming. The boy who coloured the martyrs' woodcuts and took Richard Knill's blessing so much to heart grew, in his early teenage years, into a young man tormented by a weight that no library, however Puritan, however full of sound doctrine, could lift from him on its own. He knew the law of God the way he knew his own name. His grandfather had seen to that, and so had the Puritan volumes he had read and reread as a boy grows into a reader. He knew what holiness required, and knowing it, he found himself unable to meet it and unable to silence the knowledge of his failure. For the better part of 2 years, years he would later describe with a bluntness that startled hearers who assumed a future prince of preachers must have come to faith gently, without struggle, young Spurgeon carried the conviction of his own sin like a physical burden strapped across his back. He attended chapel after chapel in Colchester, where the family had settled, searching each week for a word that might set him free, and finding instead sermons on duty, on morality, on the obligations of the righteous life. Sermons that told him precisely what he already knew and gave him no strength to become it. He tried to reform himself. He failed, and failing sank further. He read Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners and recognized his own despair in Bunyan's, which comforted him only slightly, because Bunyan, after all, had eventually found his way out, and Spurgeon could not yet see how he would find his. He would say later that those months taught him more theology than any seminary could have, that a man who has never trembled under the law preaches grace as a doctrine, while a man who has trembled preaches it as air to a drowning man. But he did not know that yet. In the winter of 1849 sliding into 1850, he knew only the trembling. The turn came on a Sunday morning in January, the 6th day of the month, in a snowstorm severe enough to close half of Essex. He had set out, as he always did, to walk to the chapel he usually attended in Colchester. But the snow came down thick and drifting across the lanes until walking any real distance became impossible. He turned, somewhere along the way, into the nearest shelter he could find, a small primitive Methodist chapel on Artillery Street, a plain little building he had never entered before and would likely never have entered at all had the weather allowed him to reach his own accustomed pew. Perhaps a dozen people sat inside when he came in, stamping the snow from his boots, shaking it from his coat, taking a seat near the back among strangers. The minister who was supposed to preach that morning had been kept away by the same storm that had redirected Spurgeon's steps. No one else was prepared to fill the pulpit, so a layman rose to do it instead. A thin man, by every account an ordinary tradesman, with no training in oratory and precious little, it seemed, in his head to say. He announced his text with the flat honesty of a man who knew he was out of his depth. Isaiah 45:22. Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is none else. He had almost nothing else. 10 minutes into his sermon, by Spurgeon's own account, the man had said everything he knew how to say, and simply began repeating himself, turning the text over and over, because he had no further material, and no way to fill the time except by returning to the same 6 words. Look unto me. Look unto me. He was not eloquent, he mispronounced words. He had, Spurgeon later judged with the affectionate honesty of hindsight, barely enough learning to keep himself in a pulpit at all. And yet it was precisely there, in that emptied-out, unpolished, repeating simplicity, that the word finally found its mark. At some point the preacher's eyes fell on the visibly out-of-place young stranger sitting near the back, snow still melting from his coat, and he fixed on him the way a man will fix on the one face in a room that looks like it needs fixing on. "Young man," he said, "you look very miserable." It was not a subtle observation. Spurgeon did look miserable. He had looked miserable for the better part of 2 years, and a stranger snowbound into a chapel he had never planned to enter could see it plainly on his face in a single glance. The preacher pressed on, undeterred by whatever surprise or embarrassment crossed the boy's expression. "And you will always be miserable, miserable in life, and miserable in death, if you don't obey my text. But if you obey now, this moment, you will be saved." Then, leaning forward, throwing whatever conviction he had into the only tool he possessed, he said the words that Spurgeon would carry, word for word, to the end of his own life. "Young man, look to Jesus Christ. Look, look, you have nothing to do but to look and live." Something broke open. Spurgeon said afterward that he did not know what else the man preached that morning, if he preached anything else at all, because in that instant the fog that had sat over him for 2 years simply lifted. He had spent months trying to do something, to reform, to strive, to earn some standing before a holy God through the sheer exertion of his own will. And here, from an unlettered layman standing in for a minister the snow had kept away, came the entire gospel reduced to a single verb: look. Not climb, not achieve, not agonize your way into worthiness. Look, the way a drowning man looks up rather than down, the way Israel in the wilderness, bitten by serpents, needed only to lift its eyes to the bronze serpent Moses had raised on a pole to live. The sun, it seemed to Spurgeon in that moment, broke through the very clouds outside the little chapel window, as though the storm that had driven him in off the road had done its work and could now let the light back in. He walked out of that primitive Methodist chapel a forgiven man. The burden he had dragged for 2 years through chapel after chapel in Colchester, listening to sermons about duty that could describe his sickness but never name its cure, was simply gone, the way a weight is gone when you finally set it down. He was 15 years old. He never learnt the preacher's name. He tried, later in life, to discover it, asked around, made inquiries, hoped to thank the man in person, or at least to know who he was, and never succeeded. It remained one of the small, quiet mysteries of Spurgeon's story that the human instrument of his conversion went to his grave unrecorded. An ordinary tradesman who filled a pulpit because no one else could reach it through the snow, spoke the only sermon he knew how to preach, and then vanished from history the moment he stepped down from it. Spurgeon did not consider this a loss so much as a fitting confirmation of what had happened to him. The message, after all, had never depended on the messenger's gifts. That was rather the point. A man with no learning and no eloquence had said 6 words from Isaiah until he ran out of anything else to say, and God had used those 6 words to save a soul that 2 years of stronger, better sermons in finer buildings had failed to reach. Spurgeon would preach that same principle for the rest of his life from far grander pulpits than Artillery Street ever offered, that the power was never in the preacher, but in the look, and in the one being looked to. It is not hard to see, looking back from the vantage of everything that followed, why this chapter of his life would remain the hinge on which all the others turned. The library at Stambourne had given him the doctrine before he had the need of it, had planted, page by Puritan page, an understanding of grace and sin and atonement that lay dormant in him like seed in cold ground. The burden of those 2 adolescent years had broken up that ground, turned it over, made him ready, and the snow, of all things, an ordinary winter storm that any other year might have simply kept him home, had driven him, by a providence he never once doubted was providence, into the one building in Colchester that morning where the plain gospel happened to be on offer. He would say later that he did not think it accidental that he had been shut out of his usual chapel that day. He thought it exactly the opposite of accidental. He thought God had closed every other door so that this one small, unlikely door on Artillery Street would be the only one open to him. He was baptized not long after in the River Lark at Ilam, walking down into the water on a spring morning in 1850 with the same plainness that had marked his conversion. No theatrics, no crowd of note, just a boy keeping a promise he had made in a snowbound chapel to the God who had found him there. Within 2 years he would be preaching himself, first to a handful of cottagers in the Fen country, then to a small Baptist congregation at Waterbeach, then, astonishingly soon, to the pulpit of New Park Street Chapel in London, where the crowds Richard Knill had once promised a small boy under a mulberry tree would begin, at last, to gather. But whatever pulpit he stood in afterward, whatever multitude filled whatever building, he never preached a sermon that had travelled very far from that one word given him in the snow. Look. It was the whole of the gospel he had received, and it became, for 40 years afterward, the whole of the gospel he gave away. The lane to Teversham ran dark that evening, no moon to speak of, and the 2 young men walking it could hear their own boots more than they could see the road. One of them, older by a few years, belonged to the Cambridge Lay Preachers Association, a modest fellowship of laymen who took it in turns to walk out to the villages around Cambridge and hold cottage meetings for whoever would come. The other was 16, freshly converted at Colchester not 2 years before, still new enough to grace that he counted himself unworthy to do anything but listen and carry the hymn books. Somewhere along that lane, the older man confessed something. He had never preached before. He did not think he could do it that night. His nerve had gone, and there in the dark, with a room of villagers waiting for a sermon, he turned to the boy beside him and asked him to take the meeting instead. Charles Haddon Spurgeon had no sermon prepared, no notes, no training beyond a Sunday school class he taught, and a heart that had been remade by a primitive Methodist's plain word a year and a half before. He had, however, a Bible, and a text came to him. He had used it, unofficially, in conversation more than once, and when the little cottage room filled with farm labourers and their wives, he stood up and preached it. He did not stumble the way he expected to. Something in him, some gift he had not gone looking for, simply opened, and the words came in order, and the people listened, and afterward an old woman told him she had not heard the way of salvation put so plainly in years. That was the whole beginning. No commissioning service, no laying on of hands, no seminary examination. A boy asked to fill an empty half-hour, who filled it instead for the rest of his life. Word travels fast in the fens, faster than it has any right to, along muddy lanes between villages that barely appear on a map. Within weeks the boy from Cambridge was in demand, Teversham again, then further out, then a request that would settle the shape of his next 3 years. Would he come and take the little Baptist cause at Waterbeach, a village a few miles outside Cambridge, with a chapel that could seat perhaps 100 souls, and a congregation that on a good Sunday numbered 40? Waterbeach was known, not kindly, for its ale. The village had earned a local reputation for drunkenness that the small Baptist meeting house had done little to dent. Spurgeon accepted the call not because the prospects were promising, but because nobody else had offered, and the door stood open. He was not yet 17. He had no license from any denomination, no ordination, nothing but the plain conviction that when a door opens, a Christian is meant to walk through it, rather than stand outside deliberating about his own readiness. What happened at Waterbeach over the following months reads, in his own later telling, less like a career beginning and more like a village being rearranged from underneath. Drunkards who had been the settled fixtures of the local taverns for 20 years stopped drinking. Homes that had been miserable grew quiet and orderly. The little chapel, built for 100, filled past its capacity, and latecomers stood in the lane outside, straining to hear through the open windows. Neighboring farmers who had never darkened a chapel door in their lives began walking in from outlying farms to hear the boy preach. Spurgeon himself, decades later, could not speak of Waterbeach without something close to tenderness. It was, he said, the place where he learned what preaching does when God is in it, learned it not from a professor, but from watching an entire village change its habits inside 2 years. He was paid little and needed little. He lodged in Cambridge and walked out to Waterbeach and back on the Lord's Day, sermon in his head rather than on paper, because he had discovered early that writing a sermon out in full and then reading it killed whatever fire the writing had contained. He preferred to think through a text until he owned it, jot a skeleton of headings, and then trust the moment and the Spirit to supply the rest. It was not laziness. It was a conviction, held for the whole of his ministry, that a sermon delivered from a manuscript was a corpse dressed for viewing, however handsome the coffin. Cambridge, meanwhile, noticed him. He preached occasionally in the town itself, and university men, some out of curiosity, a few out of genuine hunger, came to hear the boy from the fens everyone was talking about. It was through one of these Cambridge connections, indirectly, that a much larger door began to creak open, though nobody involved understood at the time how wide it would eventually swing. New Park Street Chapel stood in Southwark, south of the river, and it carried a pedigree that made its condition in 1853 almost embarrassing to speak of. This was the congregation that had once been shepherded by Benjamin Keach, the great Puritan Baptist who had suffered the pillory for his convictions. It had been served by John Gill, whose theological labors filled volumes still read a century later, and by John Ripon, whose long and fruitful pastorate had once packed the building to its rafters. The chapel itself had been built to hold 1,200 people, a monument to what the congregation had once been. By the winter of 1853, that congregation had shrunk to something under 200, scattered thin across a building meant for 6 times their number. The deacons, aging and increasingly anxious, had heard, through a chain of acquaintance running back through Cambridge, rumors of a teenage preacher out in the villages who was doing something remarkable to sleepy little congregations. They wrote and invited him to preach a trial Sunday. Spurgeon nearly declined. He assumed, reasonably, that there had been some confusion of names, that the deacons of a historic London congregation must be expecting a Mr. Spurgeon of considerably greater years and gravity than the boy who would actually arrive at their vestry door. When he finally did come up to London and appeared before them, the surprise on their faces told him his suspicion had been correct. They had written for a man. They had gotten a boy not yet 20, slight, plainly dressed, with the unmistakable manner of someone still more used to village lanes than city pulpits. The first Sunday did nothing to settle anyone's nerves. It was a wet, miserable morning, and the great barn of a chapel held only a scattering of the faithful, huddled toward the front, the vast empty spaces behind them making the smallness of the congregation feel even smaller. But something happened in that half-empty room that made the deacons ask him back rather than write a polite letter of thanks and silence. By the following visit, word had begun to travel the way it had traveled around the fens, not through advertisement, since there was none to speak of, but through people telling other people that something was happening at New Park Street that could not be accounted for by ordinary means. The chapel filled a little more each Sunday he returned. By his 3rd or 4th visit it was full. The deacons, watching pews they had not seen occupied in a decade, suddenly crowded with strangers, extended a call to the pastorate. Spurgeon accepted it in April of 1854, trembling, 19 years old, and utterly unqualified by every conventional measure except the one that mattered, the plain evidence, growing week by week in front of everyone's eyes, that God was using him. What followed over the next 18 months is difficult to describe without sounding as though the telling has been exaggerated for effect, and yet the newspapers of the day, who had every reason to be skeptical of a village boy suddenly filling a London pulpit, described it in terms nearly as astonished as anything a modern reader might reach for. The crowds at New Park Street simply would not stop growing. Deacons who had watched their chapel stand half empty for years now found themselves opening galleries that had been shut up as unnecessary, then removing pews to wedge in benches, then turning latecomers away at the door for want of any space to put them. It became clear within months that the building itself, however historic, could not hold what was happening inside it. The congregation made the decision to enlarge and rebuild, a project that would eventually give London the Metropolitan Tabernacle, but in the meantime, with the old building unusable, they needed somewhere vast enough to house a congregation that had outgrown its own chapel before it had even finished settling into a new pastor. They found it at Exeter Hall on the Strand, a hall built for public lectures and abolitionist meetings, seating several thousand. It was rented for Sunday services in 1854, and it filled. Not once, not as a curiosity that faded after a fortnight, but Sunday after Sunday, a hall meant for civic oratory packed to its doors to hear a preacher not yet 20 years old expound the doctrines of grace with a command of Scripture that men 3 times his age could not match. London's newspapers could not leave the story alone. Some reporters came out of genuine curiosity about a phenomenon nobody could quite explain. How does a boy from the Essex countryside, with no university training, no denominational credentials beyond a country pastorate, draw crowds that London's most celebrated clergymen would have envied? Others came looking for a story they could mock, and found, to their evident irritation, that mockery was harder to sustain once they had actually sat and listened. He was called, sometimes admiringly and sometimes with a sneer behind the phrase, the boy preacher, a label that followed him for years, meant by his detractors to diminish him, and adopted, eventually, almost as a badge by the crowds who kept coming regardless of what the papers said. There were cartoons, there were letters to editors questioning whether such crowds signified true religion or merely a fashionable sensation, a spiritual equivalent of a popular actor drawing audiences to a theatre. Spurgeon read some of this coverage and was stung by it more than his public composure ever let on, but he did not slow down, did not soften his doctrine to court easier praise, did not trade the substance of his preaching for anything more palatable to critics who wanted a show rather than a savior. What the skeptics could never quite account for was the content of what he preached once they were in the room. He was not performing tricks. He preached election and atonement and the new birth with a bluntness that offended the polite religion of the age, the doctrines his critics might have expected a crowd-pleaser to avoid rather than lean into. He preached hell as plainly as he preached heaven. He preached repentance in terms that left no comfortable middle ground for a listener to stand on. And still they came, in numbers that grew rather than shrank, because whatever else could be said of the boy preacher, no one who sat under him could accuse him of telling people merely what they wanted to hear. By 1856, even Exeter Hall could not contain what New Park Street had become. The congregation secured, for Sunday evenings, the music hall at Surrey Gardens, a vast glass and iron building set among ornamental gardens on the south side of the river, built originally for concerts and public entertainments, capable of holding somewhere near 10,000 people at a single sitting. It was, by any measure, one of the largest indoor spaces in England available for public assembly, and it filled for a Baptist preacher not yet 22 years old the way it might have filled for a celebrated singer or a state occasion. Cab drivers came, members of Parliament came, servant girls with their half-day off came and stood at the back rather than miss it. The crowds were so vast and so mixed, dukes beside dustmen by more than one account, that London had genuinely nothing to compare it to since the great open-air days of George Whitefield a century before. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of this rather than rushing past it. A boy who 3 years earlier had been walking a dark lane to Teversham with no sermon prepared, was now, before his 22nd birthday, drawing the largest congregations gathered anywhere in the English-speaking world for the plain preaching of the gospel. He had no seminary degree. He had never been ordained by any denominational body in the way the age expected. He had a Bible, a voice that could reportedly be heard clearly to the very back of a hall meant for 10,000 people without any mechanical aid, and a settled, immovable conviction that the doctrines of grace were not a private theological hobby, but the very engine that ought to be. The first time Susannah Thompson heard Charles Haddon Spurgeon preach, she was not impressed. This needs saying plainly, because so much has been made since of love at first sight that the truth deserves its place. She thought him countrified, awkward, a boy dressed up in a minister's coat, and she said as much to a friend. He was 19. She was a young woman of quiet good sense who attended New Park Street Chapel with her family and had heard better sermons from more polished men. Grace does not always arrive wearing the clothes we expect. It was not the sermon that changed her mind, not at first, but a small act of ordinary kindness. Spurgeon gave her a book, a copy of an old devotional work, inscribed in his own hand, not as a lover's token but as a pastor's gift to a member of his flock. She kept it. Something in the gesture, plain and unhurried, stayed with her longer than his youthful stumbling in the pulpit had. Over the following months, as the congregation at New Park Street began to fill and then to overflow, she found herself listening differently. The country boy preached like a man wrestling with eternity. By the time he was called to the pastorate in 1854, Susannah Thompson had stopped noticing his accent and started noticing his soul. Their courtship, when it came, moved at the pace of two people who took marriage seriously as a covenant and not merely a romance. Spurgeon wrote her letters, dozens of them, tender and teasing by turns, full of theology and affection tangled together in a way only he could manage, signing himself her servant in Christ before he ever called himself anything else. He was already, by 1854, the most talked-about young preacher in London, besieged by crowds, hounded by curiosity seekers, exhausted by a schedule that would have broken most men twice his age. And in the middle of all that noise, he made time to court a woman with the same patient attention he gave to a sermon text. Susannah later said that in all his letters to her, she never once found him too busy to ask how her soul was keeping. They were married on the 8th of January, 1856, at New Park Street Chapel, with half of London's evangelical world watching, and the other half wishing it had been invited. Spurgeon was not yet 22. The wedding was a plain nonconformist affair. No pomp, no bishop, only a company of believers rejoicing that their young pastor had found a wife suited to the weight he already carried. Susannah understood, better than most brides could have, exactly what she was marrying into. She had watched the crowds. She had seen the demands on his time multiply by the month. She married him anyway, and never once, in the decades that followed, treated his calling as a rival for her affection. She treated it as their shared labor. Twin sons arrived that September, Charles and Thomas, born within the year of the wedding, a double blessing that filled the young parsonage with noise Spurgeon had not known since his own boyhood at his grandfather's manse. He was, by every account, a doting father, quick to bounce a baby on his knee between sermon preparations, slower to remember that a minister of 6,000 souls also needed sleep. The household that took shape in those first years was one of deep affection, stretched thin by public demand, a pattern that would only intensify as the Tabernacle rose and the burdens of ministry pressed harder on both husband and wife. It was in the years following the twins' birth that Susannah's own body began, quietly, and then not so quietly, to fail her. The precise nature of her affliction was never fully named in the medical language of the day. What is certain is that by the late 1860s she had become, for all practical purposes, an invalid. Chronic illness settled over her like a permanent weather, confining her more and more to her room, robbing her of the ordinary freedoms of a pastor's wife, the sickbed visits, the women's meetings, the simple act of walking to church on a Sunday morning to hear her own husband preach. For long stretches of years she could not attend the Tabernacle at all. The man whose voice filled a hall of 6,000 could not be heard, most weeks, by the woman who loved him best, except through the printed sermons that arrived at her bedside like letters from a country she could no longer visit. There is a particular kind of suffering in that arrangement, and neither Spurgeon nor Susannah pretended otherwise. He grieved it in his own letters, aching over her confinement with a tenderness that never curdled into self-pity on her behalf, because Susannah would not have permitted it. She was not a woman given to complaint. What she was given to, in the long aching hours of an invalid's day, was thought and prayer, and, in time, an idea that would turn her sick room into a workshop of mercy reaching further than either of them could have guessed. The idea came, as the best ones often do, from an ordinary irritation transformed by grace. In 1875, reading through a newly published volume of her husband's, his Lectures to My Students, a book meant to arm young preachers for the pulpit. Susannah was struck by something that had nothing to do with the book's contents and everything to do with its price. She thought of the country pastors she knew of, men serving poor chapels in poor villages, faithful men on stipends too thin to buy the very tools that might sharpen their preaching. She thought of ministers starving not for bread but for books, laboring in isolated parishes with nothing on their shelves but a Bible and perhaps a hymnal, cut off from the great stream of Puritan and evangelical learning that had fed her own husband since his grandfather's parsonage library. She could not preach, she could not visit, but she could send books. She began small, and almost shyly, sending a few copies of her husband's own volumes to ministers she heard were in need, enclosing a brief note of encouragement with each parcel. Word spread the way word spreads among poor pastors who suddenly find an unexpected gift on the doorstep, quietly, gratefully, one letter of thanks prompting another request. Within a year, what had begun as one bedridden woman's private kindness had become an organized ministry with a name, the Book Fund. Susannah ran it from her sick room with the meticulousness of a woman who had found at last a labor her body would permit and her mind could master. She kept ledgers. She answered every letter personally, in her own hand, though the effort of writing sometimes cost her days of pain afterward. She solicited donations, negotiated discounts from publishers, and packed and dispatched books by the thousand to men she would never meet in this life, most of them serving churches too small and too poor to appear in any denominational report. What she gave them was not only Spurgeon's own writing, though his sermons and lectures formed the backbone of every parcel. She sent the Puritans, Bunyan, Baxter, the great old divines whose sturdy, Christ-saturated prose had shaped her husband's own preaching from his boyhood, believing, as he did, that a pastor fed on such food would preach with a fullness no seminary polish could supply. Over the years that followed, the Book Fund would place tens of thousands of volumes into the hands of ministers who had no other means of owning them, men laboring in mining villages and fishing towns and forgotten market squares, each one a little stronger in his pulpit for a parcel that had come, unasked, from a woman he had never seen. It was, in its quiet way, as vast a work of mercy as anything accomplished at the Tabernacle, and it was carried out entirely from a sickbed by a woman most of London never had reason to notice. Spurgeon noticed. He watched his wife take the affliction that had shut her out of public ministry and turn it, by grace and sheer force of will, into a private ministry that outstripped in scope almost anything either of them could have planned. He wrote of her with an admiration that had nothing patronizing in it. He called her, more than once, the truest yoke-fellow a man in his position could have asked for, and meant every word. There is a temptation, looking back at a marriage like theirs, from a distance of more than a century, to flatten Susannah into a supporting character, the quiet wife behind the great man. The record will not permit it. She built and ran, alone, an institution of real and lasting mercy, while confined to a room she rarely left, and she did it not in spite of her illness, but very nearly because of it, because illness had stripped away every other avenue of usefulness, and left her only this one, which she seized with both hands and never let go. Their marriage bent to accommodate all of this without breaking, and the bending itself is part of what makes their love so instructive to remember. When Spurgeon's own health began its long decline in later years, the gout, the kidney disease that would eventually kill him, he took to wintering at Mentone, on the French coast, in search of relief the London climate could never give him. Susannah's illness kept her, most winters, from travelling with him, so husband and wife spent long seasons of their marriage apart, he in the sun of the Riviera, she in the damp of a London sick-room, and the marriage survived those separations the way it had survived everything else, by letter. Spurgeon wrote to her constantly from Mentone, small dispatches of affection and news, and she wrote back with reports of the Book Fund's progress and news of home. Two invalids, in a sense, corresponding across a continent, each keeping the other's spirit fed at a distance that would have starved a lesser love. There is a tenderness in this that deserves to be said outright, because it is so easily lost in accounts that fix their eyes only on the pulpit. Spurgeon was, by nature, an affectionate man, quick to laughter, quick to tears, and none of that softness disappeared in his marriage. If anything, Susannah drew more of it out of him than the public ever saw. He kept, all his life, small tokens of their courtship. He wrote to her, in the language of a young man still, decades into the marriage, still glad to have won her. Whatever fame accrued to him elsewhere, At home he was simply hers, and the record of their letters bears this out more plainly than any sermon could. When Spurgeon died at Mentone in January of 1892, Susannah was too ill to have travelled with him for that final winter, and the news reached her from a distance, the way so much of their life together had been conducted. Across a gap her body would not let her close. She did not, however, retreat from usefulness after his death. If anything, the final decade of her own life became a monument to the same steady grace that had carried her through decades of illness already. She gave herself to preserving her husband's legacy, working through his papers, helping compile the great autobiography that would eventually bear his name and carry his own words to a generation that had never heard him preach. And she kept the book fund running. Widowhood did not slow the parcels of books going out to poor ministers. If anything, she seemed to redouble the effort, as though determined that the ministry born in her sick room should outlive the man whose books had first stocked it. Susannah Spurgeon died in 1903, more than a decade after her husband, having spent the greater part of both their marriage and her widowhood as an invalid, and nearly all of it as a minister in her own right, not from a pulpit, never from a pulpit, but from a writing desk beside a sickbed, with a pen in a hand that pain made unsteady and a heart that pain never made bitter. The book fund she founded continued its work for years after her death, a legacy not carved in stone but stitched together, volume by volume, out of an obscure kindness that began with one woman's irritation at the price of a book. It is worth pausing on this before the story moves back to the Tabernacle and the great public labours still ahead, because Susannah's life makes plain something the whole Spurgeon story keeps insisting on, that grace does not require a platform to do its deepest work. Charles preached to 6,000 at a time, and his voice carried across an ocean in print. Susannah preached to no one, in the ordinary sense, and yet reached further into the forgotten corners of English ministry than most bishops of her day ever managed. He held the sword. She held, without ever once resenting the smallness of her room, the trowel, building up the pastors who would go on building up their own poor and scattered flocks, long after both husband and wife had gone to be with the Lord they had served, each in the way given them, faithfully to the end. The letter arrived at the Tabernacle vestry sometime in the summer of 1866, and it was signed only with initials. A widow, comfortable enough to have £20,000 she did not need, wrote to say she wished to give it away for an orphanage for boys, and she wanted Charles Haddon Spurgeon to be the one who built it. She did not know him, she had only read his sermons. She asked nothing in return except that the work be done, and done well, and she asked to remain unnamed. Spurgeon could have been forgiven for setting the letter aside as a curiosity, one more strange offer among the hundreds that crossed his desk each month from people who had never met him but felt they knew him from the printed page. Instead, he went to see the woman, satisfied himself that the money and the wish were both real, and within a year there was a plot of land at Stockwell, south of the river, with the first foundations laid for a home that would eventually shelter hundreds of boys who had no father to shelter them. Girls' houses came later, in 1879, because a mother's grief does not stop at sons. By the time Spurgeon died, there were children at Stockwell who had never known any other home, who called the place simply the orphanage, the way other children said the vicarage or the farm, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to be raised on the compassion of a man they addressed, at his own insistence, as Uncle Charles. That word, uncle, tells you something worth pausing over. Spurgeon did not administer the orphanage from a distance, signing checks and reading reports. He walked its grounds, he knew boys by name, played marbles with them on the gravel, took an interest in whose team had won at cricket and whose collar was too tight. He wanted the place cheerful, not grim, no institutional grey, no charity school shame stamped on a child's face. A boy raised at Stockwell should walk out into the world as a boy raised by a family, not as a boy raised by a ledger. This was not sentimentality laid over the business of fundraising. It was theology walking on two legs. The same conviction that sent Spurgeon into the pulpit 6 nights a week sent him, just as surely, onto the gravel at Stockwell to ask a 10-year-old how his sums were coming along. To understand why, you have to go back to a name Spurgeon gave his own magazine, launched the year before that widow's letter arrived. In January of 1865, the first number of The Sword and the Trowel appeared, a monthly Spurgeon edited and largely wrote himself for the rest of his life, and he took the title from the 4th chapter of Nehemiah, the builders on the wall of Jerusalem, laboring with one hand while the other kept a weapon ready, because the work of rebuilding and the work of defending were, in that ruined city, simply the same work seen from two angles. Spurgeon read his own calling the same way. He never for one moment believed that preaching the gospel and feeding an orphan were two different vocations competing for his time. They were one vocation. A gospel that saved souls but left bodies to starve was not, in his judgment, the gospel of the New Testament at all. A mercy that fed bodies but never spoke of Christ was charity, and good as far as it went, but it was not yet the whole counsel of God. The sword without the trowel was cruelty dressed as orthodoxy. The trowel without the sword was kindness, with no foundation under it. He carried both, because he believed his Lord had carried both, healing the sick and forgiving the sinner in the same breath, on the same afternoon, before the same astonished crowd. This is the man behind the tabernacle's stone walls, and it is worth remembering that those walls themselves were an act of the same conviction. When the congregation built at Elephant and Castle, seating some 6,000 souls under one roof, Spurgeon refused to let the building open its doors carrying a shilling of debt. £31,000, more or less, needed raising before the first service, an enormous sum for a mid-Victorian congregation, however devoted, and Spurgeon would not preach his first sermon there until the last debt was cleared. He believed, with the plain stubbornness that ran through everything he did, that a house built for God's worship should not begin its life owing money to men. It was the same instinct, oddly enough, that would later insist an orphan's dinner should never depend on next month's uncertain collection. Faith, for Spurgeon, was not a feeling to be worked up on Sunday. It was a discipline of trust that governed how bricks got paid for and how many potatoes went into a Tuesday stew. The college came earlier still, and almost by accident, the way so much of what became a system began as a single kindness to a single person. In 1857, a young man named T.W. Medhurst came to Spurgeon wanting to preach but having no means and no training, and Spurgeon simply took him in, paid for his instruction, mentored him personally, treated the training of one poor man's gift as worth his own time. Word spread, as it always did around Spurgeon, and more young men came, and within a few years there was no longer a single pupil but a school, the pastor's college, eventually housed beside the Tabernacle itself, where by the time of Spurgeon's death it had trained many hundreds of men and sent them out to pulpits across England, into the mission field, into corners of the world Spurgeon himself would never see. He had a horror of what he called ministerial idleness, dressed up in learning, men who could pass Greek but could not preach Christ to a coal miner. The college he built was unashamedly practical, aimed at putting fire in the belly alongside grammar in the head, because he had watched too many educated men stand in pulpits and bore congregations into an early grave. He wanted preachers, not scholars who happened to wear a collar, and he paid for a great deal of it himself, out of the same royalties and gifts that might have made him a wealthy man had he kept them for his own household instead. There were almshouses too, tucked near the Tabernacle, inherited in a sense from the older congregation's long habit of caring for its own poor and elderly, and Spurgeon rebuilt and expanded that provision rather than let it wither as a quaint relic of a gentler age. Elderly women who had given their lives to needlework or service, with no family able to keep them, found a small room and a warm hearth waiting instead of the workhouse. It was not glamorous work. No crowd of 6,000 gathered to watch an almshouse roof go up. But Spurgeon counted it every bit as much a part of his ministry as the sermon he preached the same week to those same 6,000, because he had read his Bible carefully enough to notice that the Epistle of James does not distinguish between the faith that saves and the faith that clothes the naked. It simply says that a faith with no clothing in it is dead. Then there was the printed word, which Spurgeon treated not as a sideline to his preaching, but as an extension of it, reaching hands and homes his own voice at the Tabernacle could never touch. From very early in his ministry, his sermons were taken down in shorthand, corrected by his own hand on a Monday, and rushed into print by Thursday, so that a man in Yorkshire or a woman in Cornwall, who would never once hear Spurgeon's voice in person, could nonetheless read, within days, precisely what 6,000 people at Elephant and Castle had heard that Sunday morning. The sermons sold by the hundreds of thousands, translated eventually into languages Spurgeon never studied, carried by missionaries into pulpits he never visited. By the end of his life, the weekly sermon had become perhaps the most widely read piece of religious writing in the English-speaking world, and it never once stopped being, in form, exactly what it had always been, a working pastor's Sunday address to his own congregation, put down on paper because Spurgeon believed the gospel he preached to 6,000 was worth getting into the hands of 6 million. He did not stop at his own writing. In 1866 he founded a colportage association, sending out men, colporteurs they were called, an old French word for peddlers of books, to walk the roads of rural England with satchels of cheap, sound Christian literature, selling Bibles and tracts and wholesome books door to door in villages that had no bookshop and precious little else to read besides the newspaper and the almanac. Spurgeon had grown up on Bunyan and the Puritans in his grandfather's parsonage. He knew what a good book left in a poor home could do to a soul with nothing else to occupy a long winter evening. The colporteur was, in his mind, simply a preacher who could not stand in a pulpit, but could still put the gospel into a farmhand's hands, one cheap volume at a time. Stand back from all of it, the tabernacle debt-free, and thundering with singing every Sunday, the college turning out preacher after preacher, the orphanage gates opening onto 100 boys, and later 100 girls, with nowhere else to call home, the almshouse hearths kept warm for widows the world had set aside, the presses running week after week to carry one man's sermons into 1,000,000 homes, the colporteurs trudging muddy lanes with satchels of tracts, and you might expect to find, somewhere behind it, a committee, a board, a large and well-organized institution with Spurgeon as its distinguished figurehead. You would be wrong. Nearly all of it grew out of one man's insistence that he personally attend to what other men would have delegated. He read the orphanage accounts. He examined prospective students for the college himself, in his own study, often over tea, sizing up not merely a young man's Greek but his grasp of grace. He answered an almost impossible volume of letters, many from strangers asking for money, for prayer, for advice on a wayward son or a besetting sin, and he answered a staggering number of them in his own hand, late into the night after preaching had already emptied him. It cost him. There is no honest way to tell this part of the story without saying plainly that the sword and the trowel, wielded together for 30 years without a season of real rest, wore the man down long before old age had any natural claim on him. But Spurgeon did not regard the toll as evidence he had misjudged his calling. He regarded it as the ordinary cost of a ministry that refused to separate what God had joined, the pulpit and the poorhouse, the sermon and the orphan's supper, the word preached and the bread given, as though Christ himself, who fed 5,000 with loaves before he ever finished teaching them, had left his church a pattern too plain to argue with. He never spoke of these works as a legacy he was building, some monument to stand after him. He spoke of them, when he spoke of them at all, almost apologetically, as simply the things that needed doing and happened to fall to him to do. A widow had money and no one to trust it to. He trusted it. A young man had a call to preach and no means to train. He trained him. An elderly woman had nowhere to lay her head. He found her a room. A congregation needed a roof over 6,000 heads that did not owe a shilling to any bank. He raised it. None of it, taken piece by piece, looked like genius. Taken together, it looked like a man who had decided, very early and very firmly, that the gospel he preached was not merely a message to be believed, but a life to be lived out in brick and bread and printed page, sword in one hand, trowel in the other, building and defending in the same breath, because he had never once believed there were two callings to choose between. The cry came from the gallery stairs a little after 7 in the evening. Fire! The galleries are giving way! There was no fire. There never had been. But it hardly mattered, because 10,000 people believed it in the space of a breath, and 10,000 people began to move toward the doors at once. It was the 19th of October, 1856, and Charles Haddon Spurgeon, 22 years old, was 3 months into the largest regular congregation any Christian minister in England had ever addressed. The music hall at Surrey Gardens had been rented because no building in London could hold the crowds that wanted to hear him, and on that night it held more than it should have. Some said 12,000 souls packed into galleries and aisles never designed for the weight. Spurgeon had just begun to pray when the panic started at the rear. Some of his own deacons believed later that the cry had been raised on purpose, a cruel prank aimed at a young preacher whose fame had made him enemies as well as admirers. Whoever raised it, the result was the same. Men and women crushed toward the exits in the dark. Stairways jammed. People fell and were trampled by those behind them who could not see what lay underfoot. When it was over, 7 people were dead, and some 28 more carried away injured, and the great hall that had rung with hymn singing an hour before stood littered with shoes, bonnets and torn clothing where the crowd had been. Spurgeon did not know the full horror of it until later. His deacons, trying to preserve some order, urged him to keep preaching, to calm the hall with his voice while ushers worked the doors, and for a time he tried, but when word reached the platform of what was happening on the stairs, he collapsed. He had to be half carried from the building, and for days afterward he could not be persuaded that he had not caused 7 deaths with his own preaching. He was 22. He had been in London less than 2 years, and for a season afterward, those who loved him feared they had already seen the peak of his ministry and were now watching its ruin. Susannah, only recently married to him, later said that she scarcely recognized her husband in those weeks, a man who wept without warning, who could not bear to hear his own name mentioned, who spoke of resigning the ministry altogether and living the rest of his days in obscurity. He went away to the countryside, to the home of friends, and there for a time he did nothing but grieve. Some of his own church members, gathering to pray for him, worried openly that the world had lost him before he had properly begun. It is worth pausing on that word, lost, not dead. Lost to grief, to guilt he had not earned, to a darkness so total that the boy who had once run 3 miles across the fens to hear a country preacher who had stood up in a hired hall at 19 and never once feared a crowd, could not now bring himself to open a Bible without breaking down. If the furnace of affliction was going to be a theme of his life, and it was, this was where the fire was first lit, and it was lit early, and it was lit hot. He came back. That is the first thing to say, because it is the truest thing. Within a matter of weeks he was preaching again, first cautiously, then with the old fire returning by degrees, and within a few years the crowds that had fled the music hall in panic were filling the new Metropolitan Tabernacle to hear him 6 days out of 7. But something in him did not come back unmarked. Those who knew him well in later decades, Susannah most of all, said that Spurgeon carried Surrey Gardens with him for the rest of his life, not as a public wound he displayed, but as a private weight he never fully set down. He had learned, at 22, that the same platform that could hold 6,000 rapt souls could also, through no fault of his sermon, become the site of sudden death. He never again preached, his friends said, entirely without that knowledge somewhere behind his eyes. That was the first furnace. It was not the last. By the time he reached his mid-30s, a second affliction had settled on him, and this one came not from a single terrible night, but from his own body, slowly and then not slowly at all. Gout struck first in his foot, a burning so severe that for days he could not bear a sheet to touch his toe, and from there it spread, to his hands, his knees, eventually to nearly every joint that bore his weight. There were months in the late 1860s and through the 1870s when he could not stand at all, when he preached, if he preached, from a chair wheeled onto the Tabernacle platform, gripping the rail with hands too swollen to hold a hymn book. Bright's disease, the kidney ailment that would eventually help take his life, was already working in him, though it would not be named for years. He went, in time, to winter on the French coast at Mentone, seeking in the warmth some relief his London physicians could not give him, and the congregation grew used to a tabernacle pulpit that stood empty for weeks at a stretch, while their pastor lay in pain 300 miles away, dictating sermons by letter for others to read in his place. Pain like that will bend a man's spirit as surely as it bends his joints, and Spurgeon's spirit bent under a second weight that ran alongside the gout for most of his adult life, what he called, without embarrassment, his depression. He did not hide it from his congregation, and this alone marked him as unusual among preachers of his era, who were expected to project unbroken confidence from the pulpit, whatever storm raged beneath it. Spurgeon refused that performance. He told the young men training at his pastor's college, plainly and without excuse-making, that a minister of the gospel is not somehow exempted from the darkest valleys the human soul can walk, that some men called to preach hope to others will themselves know nights so black that hope feels like a stranger's word. He spoke of a despondency that came without warning and without apparent cause, that could descend on a Monday morning after the greatest Sunday of preaching he had ever known, dragging him down as if the joy of the pulpit had been borrowed against a debt now suddenly called due. Those closest to him understood that this was not simply a preacher's manner of speaking. Susannah nursed him through spells of it that left him unable to leave his room for days. He described, more than once, feeling that God himself had withdrawn to a distance he could not measure, and that no doctrine he had ever preached to comfort others seemed, in that hour, to reach down and comfort him. And yet, this is the turn that his life keeps making, again and again, in every furnace it passed through. He did not conclude from this that the doctrines were false, or that grace had failed him. He concluded the opposite. He said that it was precisely because his feelings could not be trusted in those hours that he was glad his salvation had never rested on his feelings in the first place. The same evangelical Calvinism that shaped every sermon he preached, the conviction that God's election does not depend on a worshipper's momentary sense of nearness, that Christ's finished work stands whether the believer feels its warmth or not, became for Spurgeon the very plank he clung to when every other plank had rotted away beneath him. He did not preach his way out of depression. He preached from within it, Sunday after Sunday, to congregations who never knew, most of them, what their pastor had waded through that very week to stand before them. If those two furnaces, the catastrophe of his youth and the long grinding affliction of his middle years, had been the whole of it, his story would already be one of extraordinary endurance. But there was a third fire waiting for him in his last decade of strength, and this one was not laid by a stranger's cruel prank or by his own failing body. This one was lit by men he had once called brothers. It began quietly enough, in the pages of his own magazine. In 1887, an old friend and fellow minister, writing in the Sword and the Trowel, raised an alarm about a drift he saw spreading through nonconformist pulpits. Ministers within the Baptist Union who, without ever formally denying the faith, were quietly setting aside the doctrines that had defined it, the full inspiration of Scripture, the substitutionary death of Christ, the reality of judgment, the necessity of the new birth. He called it the downgrade, the image of a road that looks level enough at first but leads, by a slope too gradual to notice, into error. Spurgeon read the warning, agreed with every word of it, and added his own voice to the alarm that same year, urging the Union to take a stand, to require of its ministers a plain confession of the Gospel's essentials, not as a test of fellowship for its own sake, but because a Union that could not say what it believed had already stopped being useful for defending what it believed. The response was not what he hoped for. Through the autumn of 1887, he pressed the Union's leadership for some clear doctrinal statement, some line drawn, and received instead delay, deflection, and eventually a kind of polite silence that told him more than any argument could have. In October of that year, unable to remain in fellowship with a body that would not say plainly what its ministers were required to believe, he withdrew his own membership from the Baptist Union, an organization he had belonged to since his earliest years in the ministry, whose assemblies he had addressed, whose younger pastors had trained in his own college. It was not a small thing to walk away from, and the Union, rather than answering his concern with the confession he had asked for, answered it in January of 1888, meeting in assembly, with a vote of censure against him, not against the drift he had warned of, but against the manner of a man who had dared to name it publicly and press it so hard. The cost of that year is difficult to overstate, and Spurgeon himself did not try to minimize it in his letters and private conversation. Men he had ordained, men who owed their pulpits to his college and their salaries in some cases to funds he had raised, went quiet rather than stand beside him. Fellow pastors who had shared platforms with him for 30 years found reasons not to be seen defending him now. He was accused, by men who had once called him friend, of pride, of overreaction, of manufacturing a crisis where none existed. He said, more than once in that season, that the loneliness of it exceeded anything the gout or the depression had done to him, because this pain came wrapped in betrayal rather than mere affliction, and a man can make peace with suffering that falls on him from outside the camp far more easily than with suffering delivered by the camp itself. He did not recant. That is the plain fact standing at the center of the whole episode, and it is worth saying without ornament. Offered every incentive to soften his charge, to accept some vaguer form of reconciliation that would have restored his standing and quieted the controversy, he refused. He believed, to the marrow, that the gospel he had preached to 6,000 people a week for 3 decades was not a preference among Christian opinions, but the substance of the faith itself, and that a union unwilling to defend it had ceased to be worth belonging to, however painful the belonging had once been. His health, already fragile from years of gout and kidney disease, did not improve under the strain of that fight, and those who watched him through 1888 and after said he seemed to age faster in those months than in the 10 years before them. What the furnace cost him then was considerable, and no honest account of his life pretends otherwise. It cost him, at 22, a season of guilt and grief so severe that his ministry nearly ended before it had properly begun. It cost him, across 2 decades, a body increasingly unable to carry him to his own pulpit, and a mind that knew despair as an intimate, recurring visitor rather than a stranger. And it cost him, in the last years he had strength to give, the fellowship of a denomination he had served since boyhood, and the public loyalty of men he had every right to call his own. But it did not cost him the doctrine. It did not cost him the pulpit, which he climbed again and again, wheeled or walking, well or racked, until his body would carry him no further. And it did not, in the end, cost him the conviction that had carried him through every one of those fires, that the same sovereign grace which had reached a 15-year-old boy in a Colchester snowstorm was still in the furnace, holding him fast. The metal came out changed by the heat. It did not come out consumed. Every Monday morning, before the ink was dry on the previous week's edition, a young man named Ferguson sat down in a cramped office near Paternoster Row with a stack of shorthand notes and a deadline that would not move. He had sat in the gallery of the Tabernacle the day before, pencil flying, trying to keep pace with a voice that rarely slowed and never repeated itself twice in the same words. By Tuesday the notes had to be transcribed. By Wednesday Spurgeon himself, exhausted from a week that had already swallowed 2 sermons, a prayer meeting, a Bible class, and a stack of correspondence 3 inches deep, would sit with the proof sheets and correct them, tightening a sentence here, restoring an illustration there, striking out anything that read well spoken but limp on the page. By Thursday the sermon was set in type, printed on cheap paper, and sold in the streets of London for a penny. That was the machinery. It sounds unremarkable until you notice what it did. It took a sermon that had lived for perhaps 50 minutes inside 4 walls at Elephant and Castle, and sent it, within a week, into places Spurgeon would never visit and among people he would never meet in this life. A collier in the Rhondda Valley, coming up black from the pit on a Saturday night, could read on Sunday morning what 6,000 people had heard preached the week before. A woman in a tenement in Bethnal Green who could never afford the fare to hear him in person, and who might have felt too shabby to sit among the well-dressed crowds even if she could, held the same words in her hands for the price of a loaf of bread. This was not an afterthought to his ministry. It was, in Spurgeon's own reckoning, half the ministry, the half that did not need him to stand up and never sit down. He said once that he would rather write a sermon that saved 1 soul in Australia than preach one that thrilled 1,000 people who forgot it by Tuesday. He may have said it half in jest, in the way he said many hard truths half in jest so they would go down easier, but the sentiment was no joke. From the earliest days at New Park Street, before the Tabernacle was so much as a foundation stone in the ground, he had understood that a sermon spoken once was a candle in a room. A sermon printed was a candle that could be carried out the door. The numbers, when you set them down plainly, still startle. By the time the printed sermon was an established weekly institution, circulation ran near 25,000 copies a week, not counting the reprints in newspapers on 3 continents, not counting the pirated editions that sprang up wherever copyright meant less than opportunity, not counting the translations. The sermons appeared in Welsh and German, in Dutch and French, in Swedish and Russian, eventually in Hindi and Chinese, and half a dozen tongues Spurgeon himself could not have read a word of. Missionaries wrote back to London, describing congregations in India and China, gathered not around a living preacher, but around a translated sermon, read aloud by a catechist, because there was no ordained man for 500 miles, and the printed word had arrived first. By the end of his life, the collected sermons ran past 60 volumes, and estimates of their total sale, reckoning every language, every reprint, every penny number sold on a street corner, climbed into the hundreds of millions of pages. No preacher before him had ever put his own voice into that many hands, and it is fair to say none since has quite matched it either, for the world that made it possible, cheap paper, a postal system, a hunger for the written sermon as a form in its own right, belonged particularly to that century and that man's readiness to use it. He never treated the printed sermon as a lesser cousin of the spoken one, some diminished thing to be tolerated, because the crowds could not all fit in one building. He worked at it. Anyone who compares the shorthand transcript with the final printed text can see the difference, Spurgeon pruning a rambling aside, sharpening an image that had landed well enough spoken but needed tightening for the eye, restoring a scripture reference he had quoted from memory and wanted checked and exact. He treated his readers with the same seriousness he gave his hearers. A working man reading by candlelight, after a 12-hour day, deserved a sentence that earned its place on the page, not a transcript that merely proved a famous man had once talked for an hour. And he knew, this is the part that ought to stop us, because it is the part he clearly felt most, that the printed sermon would go on doing its work, long after he had stopped being able to do his. He said as much more than once, that he expected to keep preaching after he was dead, through these pages, to people not yet born. It was not vanity. A man who believed as fiercely as Spurgeon did in the sovereignty of God over the means of grace did not need to inflate his own importance. He needed only to notice that ink and paper do not tire, do not age, do not eventually lose their voice to strain and stroke, and the slow failing of the body. The sermons he wrote and corrected in his study kept preaching in Sunday schools and prison cells and mission stations for a century after the man himself was in the ground at Norwood, and they preach still. Wherever a shelf holds an old volume of the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit, and someone takes it down. But sermons were not the whole of his writing life, only the largest and loudest part of it. Alongside the weekly torrent of preached and printed words, Spurgeon carried a second kind of writing altogether, slower, quieter, and in some ways more personally his own, because a sermon belonged first to the congregation that heard it, while a book belonged to the hours he spent alone at his desk, with no one listening but the page. The largest of these labors, and the one he loved most, was the Treasury of David, a verse-by-verse exposition of all 150 psalms that occupied him for the better part of 20 years, growing eventually to 7 substantial volumes. He began it almost as a private devotional exercise, working through the Psalms the way he had worked through Scripture since boyhood at his grandfather's parsonage, and it grew under his hands into something far larger than he had planned, the way most of the best things in his life seemed to. He drew deeply on the Puritan commentators he had loved since childhood, the same shelves that had shaped him as a boy in Stambourne, now feeding a work that would shape thousands of others in turn. Under each psalm he gathered not only his own exposition, but a chorus of voices across 3 centuries, Thomas Manton, Richard Sibbes, John Trapp, dozens of others largely forgotten by his own century, given new readers because Spurgeon had thought them worth quoting. He called this section of each chapter Hints to the Village Preacher, a title that tells you exactly whom he had in mind, not scholars with libraries of their own, but the country pastor with 6 books on his shelf and a congregation of 40 on a Sunday who needed help finding what a psalm meant and how to say it plainly. The work nearly broke him at points, not because the writing itself was hard, but because it was relentless. 20 years of it, carried alongside everything else, the sermons, and the orphanage, and the college, and the endless correspondence, so that the treasury became one more weight laid across shoulders already bowed under gout and the black dog of depression that visited him without warning. And yet it is, by the judgment of nearly everyone who has read it since, the most enduring piece of scholarship he left behind, still printed, still consulted, still recommended to young pastors who want to see what serious, prayerful, scripture-soaked exposition looks like when a great mind gives it 2 decades instead of 2 weeks. If the Treasury of David showed the scholar in Spurgeon, working at the long labor of exposition, then morning and evening showed something closer to the pastor at your bedside. Published as 2 companion volumes of daily readings, a page for the morning, a page for the evening, 365 days measured out in short, dense meditations on a single verse of Scripture. It became, almost from the moment it appeared, one of the most quietly influential books he ever wrote. There is no sermon's drama in it, no crowd, no rhetorical flourish built for 6,000 ears. Each entry is short enough to read in 5 minutes and rich enough to sit with for an hour. Open it to any date, and you find Spurgeon doing what he did best in miniature, taking one verse, turning it over like a jeweler with a stone, and finding in it exactly the light a weary Christian needed that morning or that night. It is impossible to say how many households have kept a copy of Morning and Evening on the nightstand across the century and a half since it first appeared, but it is not an exaggeration to call the number in the millions, and it has never gone out of print. Reprint houses still issue fresh editions of it every few years, sometimes lightly modernized in spelling, never altered in substance, because there has never been a season when it stopped being useful. A believer battling illness has opened it, and found, on the exact day needed, a meditation on suffering that reads as though it were written for that afternoon and no other. A young Christian uncertain of his standing before God has opened it, and found, in 4 short paragraphs, the whole architecture of assurance laid out plainly enough to hold on to. Spurgeon wrote those pages without knowing a single reader's name or circumstance, and yet somehow, this is the part that only makes sense if you believe, as he did, in a God who governs even the small mercies. The right page seems to find the right reader at the right hour with startling regularity. Believers who have lived with the book for years will tell you it happens too often to be coincidence. Then there was John Ploughman, a different voice altogether, and the one that shows Spurgeon's range most plainly, where the sermons preached to the nations and the treasury spoke to the scholars and the village pastors. John Ploughman's talk was written for the man who had never opened a commentary in his life, and never intended to. Spurgeon adopted the persona of a plain-spoken countryman dispensing proverbs and homely wisdom in the broad, salty English of the farm and the market town, sayings about thrift and honesty and hard work, laced with the same humor that made his sermons so alive, aimed squarely at readers who would never sit through a theological treatise, but would happily laugh their way through good sense dressed as country talk. The book sold in the hundreds of thousands, reaching working people who might never have picked up anything else with Spurgeon's name on it. And it did what all his writing did in one form or another. It met people exactly where they stood and walked them, without their quite noticing the theology underneath the humor, a little closer to the truth. Take all of it together, the weekly sermons circling the globe in a dozen tongues, the treasury laboring through 2 decades of Puritan scholarship distilled for the village pulpit, morning and evening finding its way onto nightstands it would occupy for a century and more. John Ploughman making working men laugh their way toward wisdom, and you begin to see what made this man's voice different from every other famous preacher of his age. Others drew larger crowds for a season. A few were his equal in eloquence. None matched the sheer reach of it, because none of them wrote the way Spurgeon wrote, constantly, humbly, in every register a reader might need, as though the pulpit at the Tabernacle were not a boundary at all, but a starting point. He knew what he was doing, and he said so plainly enough near the end of his life, when his body had begun to fail him faster than his mind. He could feel the sermons growing harder to preach in person, the breath shorter, the platform a longer walk than it used to be, but he never once suggested the ministry itself was slowing down. It could not slow down, because so much of it no longer depended on him standing upright in front of a crowd. The presses at Passmore and Alabaster kept running whether he preached that Sunday or lay in bed with gout twisting through his joints. The treasury kept selling. Morning and evening kept turning up, unbidden, in exactly the hands that needed it. He had built, without quite planning to at the start, a ministry that did not require his continued presence to keep working, which is, when you think about it, precisely what every faithful minister hopes for, and almost none achieve. To keep doing good after you have stopped being able to do it yourself. The Thursday deadlines are long past now, and Ferguson's shorthand pencil has been silent for well over a century, but somewhere tonight, in a language Spurgeon never spoke and a country he never visited, someone is opening morning and evening to tonight's date, or a young pastor is reaching for the treasury to see what an old Puritan said about the psalm he is preaching on Sunday, and the words that would not stay in one pulpit are doing, once more, exactly what they were built to do. At Westwood, the house he bought at Beulah Hill in 1880, there was a conservatory full of ferns and a garden he tended with his own hands. Visitors came expecting to find the most famous preacher in England behind a desk, buried in commentaries. Instead, they were as likely to find him in his shirt sleeves, kneeling in the dirt, arguing cheerfully with his gardener about the proper way to stake a rose. He grew grapes under glass and was inordinately proud of them. He kept pigeons. He walked with a heavy stick because his joints had begun, even in his 40s, to betray him. But he walked, and he laughed while he walked, and the sound of that laugh was as much a part of his ministry as the sermons themselves, though far fewer people have heard of it. Spurgeon believed laughter was a gift of God and said so without apology. He told his students at the pastor's college that a minister who never smiled at his own jokes or anyone else's had probably never been properly converted from his own self-importance. The lecture hall at the college rang with it, puns, mimicry, the deflating of pompous men in a sentence. He once remarked that if his critics knew how many good jokes he suppressed for every one he let loose, they would forgive him the ones that escaped. It was not incidental to the man. It ran alongside the tears, as naturally as sunlight runs alongside rain, and anyone who tries to tell Spurgeon's story with the laughter edited out has told only half of him. The critics did not always find this endearing. A preacher, in their minds, ought to be grave in the pulpit and grave everywhere else, as though grace itself required a permanent frown. Spurgeon disagreed, publicly and often, and nowhere did the disagreement surface more sharply than over his cigars. He smoked. Everyone who knew him knew it, and in the 1870s, a religious paper decided the whole of England should know it too, and printed a rebuke suggesting a man of his standing had no business with tobacco. Spurgeon did not flinch. He answered in the pages of the Sword and the Trowel that he intended to go on smoking to the glory of God until someone showed him plainly from Scripture that it was sin, and that he would take the matter to the Lord in prayer with as clear a conscience as any deacon took his dinner. He was not defiant for defiance's sake. He simply refused to manufacture a false holiness out of matters the Bible left free, and he suspected, rightly, most students of his life would say, that a great deal of Victorian piety was built on exactly that kind of manufactured scruple, rules invented to make small men feel large. He would repent of gluttony or vanity or an unkind word before he would repent of a cigar, and he said as much, and the paper eventually let the matter drop, because there is only so long you can scold a man who refuses to be ashamed and is, by every other measure, plainly walking with God. That walking with God was the part the critics rarely saw, because it happened behind a closed door. Spurgeon rose early and spent the first hour of every day alone with his Bible, before the letters, before the deacons, before the 6,000 who would fill the tabernacle that evening. Those who lived under his roof or served at his side spoke of finding him on his knees at odd hours, not the performed prayers of a public man, but the plain, unhurried talk of someone who had long since stopped needing an audience for it. He read the Puritans the way another man might read a letter from home. Bunyan, Owen, Manton, the old divines his grandfather had shelved in the Stambourne Parsonage, and he drew from them the conviction, worn smooth by decades of use, that a minister empties himself in public precisely to the degree that he has first been filled in private. The sermons that thundered from the Tabernacle platform were not conjured on the spot. They were poured out of a reservoir filled, hour by quiet hour, in a study most of his hearers never entered. That reservoir was drained faster than it could be filled. By his early 40s his body had begun to fail in ways his spirit never did. Gout settled into his joints, until some weeks he could not hold a pen. Bright's disease, a wasting sickness of the kidneys, dogged him for the last 2 decades of his life, and the same nervous collapse that had followed the Surrey Gardens disaster returned in cycles. Dark stretches, when the mind that had produced 10 million words in print could not compose a single paragraph. His doctors, running out of remedies, prescribed the one thing English medicine of the age reliably prescribed for a broken man of means: warmth, sea air and rest, far from London's coal smoke and London's demands. He found it at Mentone, a small town on the French Riviera, tucked between Nice and the Italian border, and from 1871 onward it became in effect his second parish, a parish of 1 patient. He usually stayed at the Hotel Beau Rivage, with his devoted secretary Joseph Harold at his side to manage correspondence, since Susannah's own health, wrecked by years of illness, kept her most winters confined to England. The letters the two of them exchanged during those separations fill volumes of their own, his, full of the sea and the olive groves and news of his health, measured almost daily, hers, full of Westwood and the students and news that the sword and the trowel proofs had arrived and needed his eye. They were apart in body those winters, and never once apart in the marriage itself, which had been built, as the earlier years of this book have shown, on a foundation that distance could bend but never break. Mentone gave him back small mercies. He photographed the coastline with a camera he had learnt to operate for the pleasure of it. He walked among the olive trees when his legs allowed, more often driven in a chair when they did not. He gathered a handful of English visitors, other invalids, other exiles from the London winter, into informal Sunday services in a hotel salon, and preached to 30 or 40 people with the same care he had once given 6,000, because he did not believe a small room excused a small effort. He kept working even there. Manuscript sheets for the Tabernacle pulpit, letters to the college, notes for the Treasury of David, all crossed the channel in both directions while he sat, wrapped against a chill that never fully left him, on a terrace above the Mediterranean. The furnace of the downgrade years, the controversy that had cost him the Union and, by his own account, cost him 10 years of his remaining life, followed him even to the south of France. He arrived at Mentone in the autumn of 1891, more exhausted than he had ever been, and those who saw him that October said so plainly, though none of them yet believed it was the last time. The winter turned hard on him quickly. Gout gave way to a fever that would not break, and Bright's disease, which had been merely a shadow over him for years, closed in with a speed that caught even his doctors off guard. Susannah, ill herself and rarely able to travel, made the crossing to be at his side, along with their son Charles. The Tabernacle, 400 miles away, kept a vigil of its own, prayer meetings that ran late into the night, deacons and members gathering simply to wait, because there was nothing else to be done, and everyone sensed there was nothing else that mattered more. On the last day of January, 1892, in a room overlooking the sea he had photographed and loved, Charles Haddon Spurgeon died. He was 57 years old. The news reached London by telegram before most of the city was awake, and it moved through the streets the way the cholera news had once moved through Southwark, except this time it was grief rather than dread that spread from house to house. His body was brought home across the Channel and up through France by train, and when it arrived at the Tabernacle to lie in state, the queue to see the coffin stretched for hours, ordinary Londoners standing in the February cold for a last look at a man most of them had heard preach at least once in their lives, and many of them had heard preach every week for 30 years. On the day of the funeral, the 8th of February, the shops along the route from Newington to West Norwood Cemetery drew their blinds, as though a member of every family in the city had died, because in a sense one had. Estimates of the crowd that lined those streets ran to the tens of thousands, costermongers and clergymen, dock workers and members of Parliament, all pressed together in the same silence. The procession took hours to pass. When the coffin was finally lowered at West Norwood, the words read over it were his own, chosen in advance, because he had planned even this, a text about resurrection, spoken over a grave he had already told his people not to fear. It would have been entirely in character for him to smile at the size of the crowd and remind everyone, in the same breath, that a coffin holds a body and nothing more. He had said as much 100 times from the Tabernacle platform, that the grave was a defeated enemy wearing a borrowed uniform, that death for a believer was nothing but the doorkeeper opening the door to a room already lit and already warm. He had preached that truth to 6,000 people on ordinary Sundays for 38 years, and on the day they lowered him into the ground at West Norwood, the truth did not require his voice any more to keep being true. What almost no one standing at that graveside fully grasped, though a few, reading the week's papers, may have begun to sense it, was that the voice had not actually gone silent. That same week, in London and in Edinburgh and in villages whose names he had never learned, presses were running off the sermon he had preached the previous Sunday, the one his stenographer had taken down and his hand had corrected before the illness at Mentone made correction impossible. Missionaries in India were reading his old sermons aloud to congregations who had never seen his face. A farmer in Iowa, a miner in Wales, a widow in a mission hall in Melbourne were opening pamphlets with his words on them on the very day his body was carried through the streets of Southwark. He had spent a lifetime insisting that the sword of the word did not depend on the arm that swung it, only on the hand that forged it, and on the day his own arm finally lowered, the sword he had spent 38 years sharpening was already moving through the world without him, faster and farther than his own 2 feet had ever carried him in life. There was a door at the Metropolitan Tabernacle that mattered more, some weeks, than the pulpit stairs. It led off the great hall into a smaller room behind the platform, and on Sunday nights, after the last hymn had died away, that door would open and close, for an hour or more, as men and women who had sat under the sermon came to find out what to do about what they had just heard. Elders waited for them there with Bibles open. Spurgeon himself, when his strength allowed it, would often come through that door too, still warm from preaching, to speak with one more soul before the night was done. It was a small door. It led to a plain room with hard chairs. But 6,000 people had just heard a man tell them that Christ receives sinners, and some of them could not go home without walking through it. This book has been trying to be a door like that one. Not the whole house, a door. You have stood, over these last 8 chapters, in a snow-covered village where a boy's grandfather kept a Puritan library and his father carried a pastor's grief home from Colchester. You have watched that same boy refuse to wait for anyone's permission to believe what he already believed. You have met Susannah, who loved a famous man and then loved an invalid, and did not love him less the second time. You have counted the bricks of an orphanage and the wounds of a controversy that cost a man his health and very nearly his life. You have sat with him in the furnace, and you have stood with him in a garden at Mentone, still praying, still preaching by proxy through printed pages, when his body had almost nothing left to give. That is a portrait. It is, I hope, a true one, and a warm one, and one that has not flattered him past recognition or diminished him into a stained glass abstraction. But a portrait is not the man himself, and what waits beyond this book is not another portrait. It is the full life, told at the length a life like this deserves, in 3 volumes that between them run to what this single book could only gesture toward. The first of them is called Born to Preach, and it begins where any honest life of Spurgeon must begin. Not in London, not at the Tabernacle, not among the 6,000, but in a man's kitchen in Stambourne, with a grandfather's sermons drying by the fire, and a boy of 6 curled in a corner with a book too old for him. You have had a taste of that world already in these pages: the parsonage, the snow, the boy who would not wait. Born to Preach opens that world all the way out. It gives you John Spurgeon's own pulpit and the particular ache of a father who preached grace to other men's children while feeling estranged from the son who would outshine him. It gives you the almond tree and the letters and the long, slow argument a boy conducted with his own conscience for years before Colchester ever happened. And when Colchester comes, the snowstorm, the small chapel, the unnamed preacher, the text from Isaiah that undid him, Born to Preach does not rush past it the way a shorter book must. It slows down and lets you feel the January cold and the 15-year-old's fear and the single sentence that broke him open: "Look unto me." From there the volume follows him through Waterbeach, where a farm boy congregation first heard what he could do with a text, and on to London, where a 19-year-old walked into New Park Street Chapel to preach a trial sermon to a room 3/4 empty, and within months could not fit the crowds who came to hear him into any building the congregation could find. It is the volume for anyone who wants to understand how a boy with almost no formal education became, before he had grown a proper beard, the most talked about preacher in England. It is a book about calling, about a call that came early, came hard, and would not be argued out of a boy who had already decided, long before anyone gave him a platform, that he had no other purpose in the world. The second volume is called The Sword and the Trowel, after the magazine he ran for nearly 30 years, and the double calling it named, the sword of the pulpit and the trowel of mercy, preaching and building, held together in one hand. You have already met the shape of this in these pages: the Tabernacle rising at Elephant and Castle, the orphanage at Stockwell with its little cottage homes instead of one grim institution, the almshouses, the college training preachers by the hundred, Susannah's sickroom ministry, sending Puritan volumes to pastors who could never have afforded them otherwise. This second volume gives you all of that in full: the fundraising, the architecture, the arguments over how to spend money that was never quite enough for what needed doing, the letters from boys and girls at Stockwell who called him father because their own fathers were gone. But the sword and the trowel does not stop at the works. It follows the wounds too, and follows them honestly, because Spurgeon's second volume is where the cost of his ministry comes fully due. It is where you sit with him through the disaster at the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, when a false cry of fire in an overcrowded building led to a crush that killed people who had come only to hear him preach, and where you watch a young man, barely into his 20s, carry that grief for the rest of his life. It is where the downgrade controversy is told at the length such a painful chapter demands, the slow drift of the Baptist Union toward a theology that had quietly stopped believing the things it once confessed, Spurgeon's public warnings, his withdrawal from the union he had loved, and the censure that followed, a formal vote of the Assembly against the man who had done more than any other living Englishman to fill its pews. The sword and the trowel does not soften that grief to make him look invincible. It shows you a man in his 50s, sick with gout and kidney disease and a darkness of mind he called his own personal thorn, standing almost entirely alone against colleagues who would not follow him, and paying for that stand with what little health he had left. This is the volume for anyone who wants to know what evangelical Calvinism actually cost the man who preached it, not as an abstraction defended from a safe distance, but as a conviction that built orphanages with one hand and absorbed censure with the other, and never once let go of either. The third volume is called Words That Will Not Die, and it is the one that answers a question every reader of this shorter book has probably already begun to ask, without quite framing it. Why does any of this still matter now? Why does a Victorian preacher, dead since 1892, still fill more shelf space in a Christian bookshop than most living authors, still get quoted from pulpits on both sides of the Atlantic, still have his sermons read aloud in prisons and translated into languages he never heard spoken? You have had the opening notes of that answer already in these pages, the printed sermons that circled the globe every week of his ministry, the stenographer taking down words as fast as he could speak them, the penny pamphlets that outsold newspapers. Words That Will Not Die takes up that thread and follows it forward, past his death, into the 20th century and into our own. It tells the story of the Treasury of David, that vast commentary on the Psalms he built over 20 years, gathering the voices of Puritan and Reformer alike into one living conversation with Scripture, a work still consulted by preachers who could not name a single other book he wrote. It tells the story of the sermons themselves, the New Park Street Pulpit, and the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit, volume after volume, published every single year of his ministry without a gap, an unbroken weekly record that makes him very likely the most fully preserved preacher in the history of the church. It tells you what happened to the downgrade controversy in the decades after his death, how the very drift he warned against did in fact hollow out denomination after denomination in the century that followed, and how his stand, dismissed as narrow and divisive by many in his own day, came to look to later generations less like stubbornness and more like foresight bought at great personal cost. And it brings the story all the way to the present, to the pastors who have never set foot in England opening a battered volume of his sermons for Saturday night sermon preparation, to the archives and societies that keep his words in circulation, to ordinary readers who pick up a devotional drawn from his writing and find, a century and more after he preached it, that the words still do what words are supposed to do to a human heart. This is the volume for anyone who has read this far and wondered whether a 19th century preacher can still speak to a life lived now. The answer the volume gives is not an argument, it is simply the record of how many people, in how many places, keep finding out for themselves that he can. Together the three books do something this one could never manage on its own. They let you live inside the whole arc of a life, not sampled in the 8 facets this portrait has offered you, but walked through in the order it actually happened, with room enough to feel the weight of each season before the next one arrives. You will meet the boy again in Born to Preach, but at far greater length than the boy who would not wait could give you here, and you will understand better, by the time you finish it, exactly what kind of soil produced the preacher. You will meet Susannah again in The Sword and the Trowel, but you will watch her marriage develop year by year, instead of in the single chapter this book allowed her, and you will understand better what it cost her, and what it gave her, to love an invalid for the second half of a marriage that began with a famous man. You will meet the furnace again, the depression, the gout, the slander, the downgrade, but at the pace grief actually moves, not compressed into the shape a single chapter requires, and you will meet, at last, the fuller reckoning of what this all adds up to, a man who is still, more than a century after his death, doing exactly what he did on his last ordinary Sunday behind that vestry door, meeting people one at a time, at the point of their need, and pointing them past himself toward Christ. It is worth saying plainly, before this book closes, what it has not tried to be. It has not tried to argue you into admiring him. Nothing in these pages has been building toward a verdict you are meant to reach at the end, some tidy conclusion about greatness or genius that the whole book was quietly angling for, all along. That is not how a life like this works, and it is certainly not how Spurgeon himself would have wanted to be read. He did not want disciples of Spurgeon. He wanted, as he said again and again from that same pulpit, sinners brought to Christ, and if this book has done anything right, it has kept pointing past the man toward the God he spent his whole life pointing toward. The 3 volumes waiting beyond this one will do the same, only longer, only slower, only with room to let the whole shape of a life bear its own witness rather than have that witness summarized for you in a closing paragraph. So think of this book, if you will, as that door behind the platform, small, plain, easy to walk past if you did not know what waited on the other side. You have stood in the doorway for 9 chapters now. You have heard enough to know the shape of the room beyond it, a boy under an almond tree who could not wait to believe what he already believed, a preacher who filled the largest hall in London and then built one larger still, a husband who loved a sick wife for 30 years without complaint, a builder who raised an orphanage out of nothing and a magazine out of a spare hour a week, a man who stood alone against his own denomination because he would not soften what he believed the Bible plainly taught, a sufferer who preached through gout and depression and grief because he believed, to his very last breath, that the words were not really his to withhold, and, at the end, an old man in a garden at Mentone, still praying, still working, still certain that the sermons he could no longer preach in person would go on preaching without him. They have. That is, in the end, the whole reason these 3 volumes exist, and the whole reason this doorway was worth building. His body is in West Norwood Cemetery in London, under a stone that carries a line borrowed from the book of Hebrews, spoken first of a man who offered a sacrifice thousands of years before Spurgeon was born. He being dead, yet speaketh. It was true of Abel. The church has long believed it true of Spurgeon too, and every reader who has ever opened one of his sermons a century after his death and felt the old fire catch, has found out for themselves that the words on the stone were not sentiment, they were simply accurate. Go then, and read the fuller life. Read Born to Preach for the boy, and the calling that would not let him wait. Read The Sword and the Trowel for the works his hands built and the wounds his ministry cost him. Read words that will not die for the legacy that is, right now, in some pulpit you have never heard of, still doing exactly what it did in 1855, taking hold of an ordinary heart and turning it toward Christ. And whichever door you walk through next, go with this old preacher's own blessing following you, the one he gave his people so often it became a kind of signature, the God of all grace, who has called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after we have suffered a while, make us perfect, establish, strengthen, settle us. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen.